Morning all. So I finally got round to making a video. Not very well, as you'll probably see, but this is largely for the guys on the Bordersdown forums, but obviously for anyone else who's interested too. We're going to take a look at emulation via this Dell PC that I've put together, the software side of it on the PVM here. Now, so there we go, switched on, and again the monitor, like I say, is off. So the goal originally of this really was to see if I could buy a cheap business machine for 70 odd quid and just get Street Fighter 03 on the Saturn running at its correct resolution on a CRT. The reason why I love Street Fighter 03, I'm a big fan, and I love the Saturn version. I've owned many Saturns, pretty much every model apart from the Navi. I've repaired, I've modded or done something too. I lived in Japan as well, where I actually owned Street Fighter 03 numerous times. I think the last time I bought the RAM pack was £30. It's now obviously over 10 times that if you go to eBay, these kind of sites. So I wanted to get that running really well. It's got an extra dramatic battle mode. It looks really nice. Obviously you've got the advantage of the Saturn pad. Now I have got Street Fighter 03 in my arcade machine, which you might have seen on the other video I've made, or sorry, I am making. There's the Windows chime. So monitor goes on, and what you'll see is we load straight into the front end. You'll see it says, or hopefully you can see this, it says test mode down there in the bottom right hand corner, and you need to put Windows into test mode in order to install CRT Emu drivers. I've left it in test mode just in case I ever want to faff around anymore, and here we are. So now this is what's interesting. The last couple of iterations of RetroArch, that's 1.72 and 1.73, have included SwitchRes CRT. Now, as I've said before, you've been able to get your arcade ROMs or your console ROMs, whatever, on a CRT at the correct resolution for some time, and there's lots of different solutions to it. I was using a Pi, which is actually on top of the monitor at the moment, or you can use obviously a PC, a lot of people use, but due to the difficulty of Saturn emulation, I've been able to run it on my desktop PC for the last couple of years, maybe longer, really well, and Dreamcast and stuff too. However, what I wasn't able to do is get it to run at the correct resolution or the original resolution, on a CRT. With the induction of these things into the last couple of iterations of RetroArch, what you can now do is run SwitchRes along with Calamity's Emu drivers, and it actually outputs at the Saturn's native resolution, which is absolutely fantastic. Now to do that on here, you've got a few different options, but I'm actually using just a VGA to BNC cables, and then I'm using a sync combiner, which is just looks like a sort of aerial adapter basically to combine the syncs on the back of the system. I have got a UMS coming out on my SCART adapter coming, so I can run from VGA to SCART and then go straight into the PVM there, and I've got some retro gaming cables I can hook up, just really to compare. Well, this worked perfectly, of course. There are no issues whatsoever. I should mention as well, if the sound sounds crappy, it's just running from the internal speaker at the moment. This was just a sort of quick setup, really, to show you how things run. Now, like I say, this was just to run Street Fighter 03. If I could do that, I was going to originally just boot into that, and that was it. I was going to be set. If you can hear a high-pitched whine, actually ignore that. The monitor does that upon start. It will settle down very shortly. So the interesting thing is, I'm sure you can see, is what actually happened. Now I run my desktop, which is to the left, which you can't see actually, obviously in this shot. That runs on a plasma screen. And it runs all of this stuff obviously without even breaking a sweat. It's a 4.5 gigahertz overclock system, yada yada yada. The GTX 1060, but I didn't think I'd get similar or the same results on here. Now, as you can see, and as we'll take a look at, I can get all the way up to Nintendo Gamecube on a £75 business machine. Kind of straight out of the box, really. So we'll start actually down, we're going to start here actually with Dreamcast. So this is Dreamcast running on Recast or Rycast, the Rycast or Recast core on RetroArch, and this all runs at its native resolution, which was 480i. There were a couple of games that ran at 240p, obviously Bango, the Street Fighters, and I think you could force a couple more to do that. But everything you can see here, I've tested. It all works perfectly without any issues whatsoever. There's a couple of, there's a couple of minor issues on the Virtua Tennis, but if we launch something like Power Stone, you'll see here actually that this is on, say, a £75 business machine, and this will run the Dreamcast pretty much perfectly, as you'll see here. So loads our remap file, we get the Dreamcast boot up sequence, of course. There's a bit of a longer delay there than there would be on the console, I find. And here we are, we're in. So, and this just plays exactly as you'd expect. I've owned, you know, Dreamcast more than once. I've had Japanese, US and PAL systems. I've even had the limited edition ones, or one of the Hello Kitty ones. So, and I've played these games, you know, pretty much extensively, as quite a few of us have, and I can't tell any difference between this and the original, like I say. So this just runs as you'd kind of expect. So yeah, and as I'm sure you can see, it runs perfectly, no issues, no glitches. I've set up all the hotkeys on the pad, so we can just boot out again back into this is big box front end. Excuse me, this is big box front end that I'm running here. So everything runs. Yep, Shenmue even runs. The first one does. The second one, the second one does too. I just haven't really played through that. I actually don't really like Shenmue, so it's not that exciting. Again, so everything you can see on here runs. So we've got Bango. This is the only one that presents a bit of an issue. It's supposed to run, I think, in 240p. Because the native internal resolution is 480i, and I can't seem to change that in the config, because if I could, then I would set up an individual instance of RetroArch just to run this at with this core to run at 240p. Can't seem to do that. Can't seem to change it with the left start or whatever the combination was either. But you know, that's one game. So that runs. Borderdown runs. Cannon Spike. Well, everything that you can see on here. Capcom vs SNK2, Cosmic Smash. I've had to run that actually through null DC rather than the RetroArch core. But everything here works perfectly. Jet Set Radio or Jet Grind Radio, as it's confusingly called. This all runs pretty much perfectly. I would say 99.9% of the time runs perfectly. Yeah, so you know, a Zero Gunner. I don't know. Let's run that, for example. Boots in. You can get into the BIOS obviously in here as well and change everything. Like I say, Dreamcast emulation has been at a really decent standard for a while, but I've never been able to get it simply, I suppose, to output at its original resolution on a CRT TV. And this is a very relatively simple way to do that. Okay, so that's just saying about our memory card and these kind of things. So here we are. I don't know if I've actually run this yet, but oh no, I would have. I've tested them all. Actually, I've tested them all. So, you know, and sort of so on and so forth. Again, any audio sort of sounds naff or slightly odd, it's not the game. It's the internal speakers. I haven't hooked up a proper speaker yet, but I have hooked up my Bluetooth headset and some regular old stereo style headphones, and they all run perfectly and sound great. There's no issue at all on there. But just for now, I've got the internal speaker running, as I don't have any other PC speakers, so to speak of. It does run, and I've got a B&O sort of Bluetooth cube thing. I don't want to use it for this. It ran through that actually perfectly, obviously, as well. I've got a Bluetooth adapter, which I'll show you. But anyway, that's obviously Dreamcast. Again, it's all hotkeyed up to run from here. So that runs, you know, like I say, perfectly. It's sort of not really a surprise. Sega Genesis or Mega Drive, you have to write Genesis in there annoyingly to get the things to display. That all runs perfectly. Sega CD or Mega CD runs perfectly. This was our original intention. So how I've set this up is so it doesn't just run the emulators, so you can actually use the original pads or versions of original pads via adapters or USB versions of those pads. So what we're going to do, if we I'm actually just going to switch the pad over, and I've got to walk in front of the camera to do this, so I'm just going to stop it, switch the pad over and then resume. So we are back at the menu screen again, and if we just launch Street Fighter 03, we'll launch it with the keyboard rather than the pad. You can see it runs. You'll notice the boot up sequence doesn't quite fit this screen. That's normal because the Saturn or the games would switch resolutions accordingly, and some like Thunder Force 5, is that what I'm thinking of? Yeah, and quite a few actually used a menu in 480i and then would switch to 240p and things like that. Burning Rangers does something similar, and there are more games obviously that do that. But you'll see when we get to the main sequence, the main title, that actually it all fits, you know, as it should on there. So here we are. Obviously at the menu screen, as you can see, this is the Japanese Saturn version. This is my preferred version, as I've said. I think it actually plays slightly better than the Dreamcast, and there's an extra dramatic battle mode as well in there. And you've got things like Zangief's got his bloods, you know, sort of shooting out of his head. So yeah, you know, runs perfectly as far as I can see. Every now and again, and I mean I've played this probably 50 times, and I think it's happened maybe twice, you'll get an odd sort of frame jump somewhere, and that's not an issue with the power. I don't know exactly what that is, because it rarely appears. As you can see, runs perfectly. The music is playing perfectly. Again, it's just the crappy internal speaker, you know, and that all runs as you can probably see. You know, I'm not, you know, attempting to actually beat Gen at this point, but just to kind of show you, you know, how well it runs. Obviously there, you know, all the buttons are mapped correctly. We'll talk about that in a minute, because that's by far and away the most frustrating thing with RetroArch, is the configuration settings actually, and I think that's where people tend to give up. So that runs obviously perfectly, and everything else on that list runs as well. So here we are again back at the menu. I just realised I probably should have shown you the sort of RGUI interface in the RetroArch cores there, so you can see it's running at the correct resolution. But I've got a fair amount of experience at doing that, and I can assure you it does run at the correct resolutions. I wouldn't have them on here if it didn't. Now, like I said, it was really made, this system, as I've said, to run Street Fighter 03. That was it. I didn't want it to do much else. But as we've seen, it can run Dreamcast, and once I found that, I was like, wow, okay, what else can it do? Because, you know, my desktop to the left, it's 4.5 gigahertz overclocked. You've got your GTX 1060 in there. Not that that makes a huge amount of difference, other than for things where we're using kind of advanced shader options and up in resolutions. It actually runs it largely not massively differently to that. So I thought, well, let's have a little look at the Gamecube. Now, this doesn't use a RetroArch core. There is a Dolphin RetroArch core. I found it a bit buggy, so I just use one of the many versions of Dolphin I've got. I think this is just stable. I use this. This is stable 5.0, so it's a couple of years old now. But if we launch the Gamecube Emulator, this, you know, bearing in mind this is a £75 business PC with I've changed nothing on it other than do the software side. All of these games largely run, you know, perfectly. So if we launch something like the Wind Waker, which is potentially quite difficult to emulate, there you see the flash of the Dolphins front GUI there. So here we are. I have saved this to save us the, you know, 15 minutes of an intro. As you can see, this runs without any issue whatsoever at all. This is just me on the first level. It does drop frames every now and again because it's a pretty intensive, didn't do that. It's an intensive game, but as you can see, for the most part, for a £75, I said again, for a £75 business machine, it runs everything pretty much perfectly. I've got the Wii adapter for this with the Gamecube controller, which is picked up and used perfectly. I'm not using that right at this moment. At the moment, I'm just using an Xbox 360 pad with the wireless adapter. But as you can see, it runs pretty much perfectly. The only issue we encounter is it will occasionally slow down. Oh, it's not doing it now. It will occasionally slow down there, and other places where you're sort of there's lots of sort of dense kind of foliage because of the amount of, well, because it's got a kind of buffer there. As you can see, just me running around, whatever, you can talk to people, but I'm not going to bother. Runs pretty much perfectly. This is with VSync on as well, so you can Z target him, etc. L target him, I should say. This is with VSync on too, so that obviously runs pretty much perfectly as well. So like I say, we're back here again at the menu. Just exited out of that. Again, it's all controlled via the pad largely. There's a couple of emulators I've not set up, but you know, bearing in mind all I wanted to do was run this at its original resolution on a CRT, well, Street Fighter 03. We've now got GameCube games running almost as well, you know, not quite as, to be perfectly honest, as I have on my, you know, desktop, which probably cost me with upgrades between £600 and £800 to put together. That obviously, you know, on my desktop, my main desktop, I'll run things in a much higher internal resolution. They look kind of beautiful. I can get all up to 4K without missing a beat. This will even more. This will run Wii games as well. I just chose not to put them on here because I didn't want this as a Wii machine. Again, you'll notice there's no arcade systems on here because I didn't want this as an arcade machine. That wasn't the purpose. I've got an arcade machine, and I sometimes think it's a little bit odd having arcade games on your, you know, TV, so to speak. So again, you know, it's TurboGrafx CD, PC Engine CD is what it is. These run all perfect as well, and this is just a very brief test. You've obviously got your SNES stuff. This is just things I've put on here, largely again things that I've owned and have just kind of enjoyed really in the past. 2 instances of Dracula X for some reason, but again, just, you know, the Fireman is a great game, but these obviously all run perfectly. It's really the higher end stuff. The biggest surprise is probably PS2. This wasn't something I really was that interested. Again, I've got a PS, you probably can't see it, but I've actually got a PS2 console lurking just down here, which I plug into my PVM and use primarily for the shooting games like Time Crisis and all this kind of stuff. And I've actually got, these are all ripped again, from apart from Dead on Patchy, these were ripped from my original discs. So this is Thunder Force 6, which again, I didn't really want it to run PS2 games. I wasn't that interested. This is running again in 480i, as you'll see, because I've got it, you know, I've got a PS2 console, and I've also got the emulators on my PC where I can really ramp up the internal resolution. They look really kind of beautiful. They look like PS3 games, or, you know, especially something like Katamari Damacy, which is great. But you know, they run on here and they run in their internal resolution. This has got VSync turned on again, so it's, you know, you're really sort of, you're hitting the GPU a little bit. I don't know if this looks juddery at all through the camera, but it's not. And again, I keep saying it, this is a £75 business machine that we've managed to do this on, which is all pretty impressive. And a lot of this, not this emulator actually specifically, but a lot of this, certainly the Saturn stuff, is possible because of the new versions of RetroArch, you know, which are great. I think probably the most exciting feature for most people, not necessarily me, for me the most exciting thing was being able to get Street Fighter 03 to run accurately, you know, via RetroArch on a CRT. It's probably going to be this feature next. So if I run Bare Knuckle 3, if I run the Genesis emulator, the Mega Drive emulator, as you can see, I'm running original Japanese 6-button pads through a Mayflash adapter, through the USB, and we'll talk about the controller settings and how much of a pain that is to set up. But we're in obviously Bare Knuckle 3. If you go to the menu, which I've set to the control pad, and you go to latency, you'll see there that you can change the latency. Now, this uses run ahead. It does cause problems in some games, mainly the CD based games, although the Mega CD stuff works brilliantly. Mega Drive, SNES works really well, although I use a Bluetooth Retrobit pad, and I use BSNES accuracy, and actually there's maybe a frame of latency I've noticed running via this setup. So actually I tend to leave it off for the SNES. It doesn't make really, well, it does make some difference, but if you use latency with BSNES accuracy, that core, that emulator, there will be issues of sound and stuff like this. So this all runs, you know, you'll see, say it's running. So I tried quite a few Mega Drive games, and the delay tended to be between 2 and 4 frames. So you can do it perfectly for each game if you want. I didn't really want to. So actually what you've got is this now set to 3 frames, and it's so responsive, it's ridiculous. I think it's slightly more responsive than the actual Mega Drive console. I've owned this game. This is actually an English translation of Bare Knuckle 3, but I've owned this. I've owned, again, virtually everything on the ROM list. But you literally tap the pad, and we're kind of, oh, that was me missing. You know, kind of good to go, really. That kind of odd jerkiness is me messing with the pad. So, you know, it really is great, the run ahead feature. Not for everything, like I say. It does work with the arcade games. I've tested GroovyMAME and stuff on here. I don't want to make an arcade box. That wasn't the purpose of this at all. And then we can just exit out of there with the pad again. The purpose, as I've said, was to get a console box. But yeah, that's great. Run Ahead works fantastically on a lot of different stuff. One of my favourites, maybe oddly, that it runs really well on is actually Final Fight CD, because I always felt on the emulators, this is the Japanese version, not the terrible edited UK or US version. I just felt it was just, I don't know, it was a bit off, even on the original hardware, which I've owned several times again for this. And I think I've got a disc version only of this lurking around in my CD wallet. But with, again, with the latency adjusted, I think this is adjusted for 2 frames. I worked out. It runs, you know, the response. It's fantastic. So, and as you can see here, probably the CD audio works perfectly with this. I had to use Genesis GX Plus emulator. I prefer Pico Drive, but it's the only one that it would work with. With Pico Drive, you get sound jumps, and I know you can't necessarily see kind of how responsive it is, but it's, you know, it is a noticeable improvement on there. And like I say, some emulators will take this, some won't. The CD based ones there's generally difficulties with. The Saturn, I can notice a frame delay, but I'm so used to it, really, and so used to playing emulators, I sort of account for that, I think, when I play. And, you know, the fact that I can just get certain Saturn games running on this system is, at the original res, is fantastic. That's probably kind of it. There's one other thing I should probably talk about, and then do a quick kind of recap of what we've done here. It's not that brief a video, really, but it's just a case of I wanted to show, say, mainly the guys from Bordersdown and anyone else who was interested, that actually you can get for 70 quid odd. Excuse me, for 70 quid odd, you can get yourself a you know, a business PC over there, you know, all day long from eBay. They range from about 60 quid to about 120 quid that will run everything perfectly. If you wanted to get, you can get it up to, I don't know what the Optiplexes go up to. I did see one for 3.4 gigahertz. Obviously emulation is primarily based on your CPU speed. Not a lot else matters, really. You might want to go with a, you know, a bit of a beefed up GPU, get a bit of Radeon, but like I say, this was all included. I've got another couple of Radeons actually lying about, which I was going to use for an arcade build. I didn't in the end. I used something else. Well, I used a different Radeon, and I've not tried those, and I probably won't bother, if I'm perfectly honest. But anyway, that's kind of that on the emulation front. Everything runs, you know, brilliantly up to Gamecube, which was never really the intention, but it does. You could get the Gamecube running better. You know, I know ways we could do that to get them running better, but I'm pretty happy with how it runs at the moment. And actually, I've done enough kind of meddling around with emulation for the last, oh God knows, I don't know, over 10 years to sort of, you know when things are fine. So if I just leave Guy there. So a couple of issues really. For those that don't know, the biggest kind of bugbear of RetroArch consistently seems to be its control configuration. You know, I really like the new changes in RetroArch. I think they're absolutely fantastic. I think the use of SwitchRes has been kind of a long time coming. Has the run ahead for latency. The issue with it, you know, but the fact that they can't get the controls or how to configure the controls, what I would consider correct, is, you know, a massive oversight, I think. You know, people love it and explain why it's like that, and it does make sense, but I still can't quite get my head around it. So much so, it took me about 5 hours to configure the controls how I wanted to, and in the end it didn't work, and I'll tell you very briefly why. So actually I got rid of all of the instances of RetroArch and did it a completely different way. So hopefully you can see this. The desktop's running at 640 by 480, so it's interlaced. This is Windows 7. But this is the folder for this is the folder for Launchbox, which is the front end obviously, or big box, for launching everything. And as you can see, in order to get the controls to work correctly, I had to create, or the easiest way I found, the absolute bottom line easiest way without any grief and without taking me 5 hours of scratching my head and all the rest of it, was just to create separate instances of RetroArch for every single emulation core. Now this actually worked out a lot better than I thought, because it then means I can make changes and it doesn't affect anything else in another core. I can just leave it to save configuration on when I exit. But for those of you that are interested and might be wanting to do this and do have issues, you know, this is the way that I did it. So you've got your Neo Geo N64, PC Engine CD, and all, you know, Sega Mega CD, this kind of stuff. Each core is a separate emulator. They're not huge folders either, but like I say, I'm not using this hard disk for anything else. There's only a 250 gig hard disk in there. I've got a few spares of different sizes, but that's perfect. That will run everything like you've seen with space to spare as well. It's just an absolute ball ache trying to get the controller configurations to work, because as I now understand it, and I'm fairly au fait with RetroArch, but I've never really done this before, so I want to use different controller and I want to use original controllers as much as I can for the original systems. So what happened was, you'd go to the main menu, settings, input, and you would input your controllers, and then you would go to the quick menu, and those would be mapped per that system core. Now that sounds fairly straightforward, but in the system core you have to adjust the buttons by moving left and right, which is ridiculous because you don't know what the binds kind of correlate to. It doesn't make a lot of sense maybe when I'm saying it, but try this and it will. What also, if you use, you know, sort of third-party pads like, you know, this kind of dodgy looking thing here, it's not necessarily, well, it's not assigned as a Play Sega controller, and it's not assigned, well, it's assigned as a USB gamepad, but it reads the up, down, left and right, not as hat, but as axis. And the actual axis, I suppose, what it labels them or binds them to, isn't the kind of RetroArch given axis. So they are, bear with me here, but you set this up in the main menu, you go into the quick menu to change things, and you can't because the options aren't there. And then actually when you save the game config or the core config, it overrides those controls. What the long and the short of it is, it's a massive pain in the arse. So to save you 5 hours of faffing around, and I do mean 5 hours, that's how long it took me until I just threw it all in and did this. This is a far easier way. I'm sure someone's going to comment and say, no, you can do it this way. I'm sure you can, but for me personally, this is the easiest way of doing this. Just an individual core, then I know what I'm doing with. It's basically like an individual emulator, like you would have done kind of back in the day before RetroArch, and that works, you know, really well. I mean, this really was, to get it up and running, this system was really straightforward. It took about an hour from start to finish to do everything, and then I spent absolutely ages farsing around with the controls. So, you know, you don't want to kind of go down that route. But yeah, I mean, it's great, as you've probably seen. From everything we've got running, CRT SwitchRes is now built in. You just literally go into the menu and click that on. I can now switch controllers, because I've got a Bluetooth SNES pad for my NES and my Super Famicom cores, and I also use that for another one as well. For Nintendo 64, I actually use the 360 pad. I've got a couple of pads because I've got a Nintendo 64 along with some games, so I'm just going to grab one of those pads. I've got a box pad actually, so I'm going to use that with a Mayflash adapter. The Nintendo Gamecube, you can use the 360 pad, or I've got the Wii adapter where I'm just plugging a Gamecube pad in and it picks it up straight away. Saturn, I use that dodgy pad, but I'll pick up a converter. Dreamcast, I was going to use the original pad because I've actually got a converter, but I'm probably going to stick with the Xbox. Mega CD, 6 button again, and kind of so on and so forth. Certainly PlayStation is the only one I don't really use an original controller. I just use the 360 pad because I find it slightly better, although I do have a couple of Bluetooth controllers for the PS3 here, because I've got a PS3 and I can set those up as well. I've got a GameCube with a Viper chip under the bed actually, but I tend not to use that. This looks just the same, and actually I run most of the GameCube stuff on my desktop as well. But I think for £75, say it's an Optiplex 3010. It runs a Radeon 5450. It's got about 8 gig of RAM. It's got a 250 gig hard disk in there. You're running about 3.2, like I say, gigahertz. You can get faster CPUs, of course. If you did your own build, probably for a couple of £100, you could build something far faster that would boot everything, including all the PS2 stuff. But like I said, I use Calamity's CRT Emu drivers. There is another option. I've typically forgotten what it's called. It's not compatibility. It's a different option that will run on lots of different cards. I've never used it. I've heard it can be hit and miss. It's just what I've heard. I'm sure it probably is fine as well. But for me personally, this does exactly what I wanted it to do. It runs everything in their original resolution, their original refresh rate. It will run GroovyMAME and these arcade kind of things, but I don't want an arcade box. I've got an arcade machine. I don't want it to do that. I have tested this. For those that are interested, this will run Naomi core stuff. It runs Dolphin Blue perfectly. It runs Marvel vs. Capcom 2 and Street Fighter 03 Upper largely perfectly-ish. But again, those games, it outputs 03 Upper at 480i like the original hardware. So I don't want to do that. I want to run Street Fighter in 240p. But Dolphin Blue looks great. It's not quite as simple as just clicking the game title as you saw. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but it's actually not much more complicated. So if you don't have big box, this is kind of the free alternative, which is launch box, and you can see I've got it set up here anyway. I just don't really like how it looks on this monitor. You know, you click on that and you've got all this kind of stuff. But again, everything you see here works. I've tested these. I've played through at least 3-4 levels, you know, much more in some cases, but everything on here obviously works perfectly. Even, you know, Jet Force Gemini, which I don't like that, but a lot of people do. GameCube stuff is largely perfect. I'd say it's about 98% there. PS2 is a bit finicky. That's just because of the emulator itself and what's needed to run. But again, I've got a PS2 and I've got that running at really high reses on the PC perfectly. Katamari Damacy occasionally slows down. The other stuff doesn't actually on here. Thunder Force 6 runs, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, Knights, the PS2 version there, Fantavision. That all runs pretty much perfectly. That's Dynamite Decker there as well. Cool, so that's about it, guys. Hopefully that was of some use, but you know, you can see obviously you saw a little bit about Run Ahead, a little bit about the CRT. It's probably, this video has been way too long. I could have been far more succinct, but it was kind of a one take thing pretty much that I just wanted to make quickly. So say the guys from Bordersdown that are interested, or those that are interested, you know, as I've said, I had a Pi already that's running RGB Pi, and I've run Pi to SCART and various other things as well, and that was really good, but I just wanted to literally run Saturn 03, and then I thought, well, we can run all this other stuff that the box can, so actually I might as well just keep this as my main kind of system. You could make a much smaller form factor. You could take that apart fairly easily. I've done it before, and pull things apart like that, you know, and make it smaller. You could fabricate your own case or whatever if you wanted it to look beautiful. I'm going to probably make some changes to that case anyway, but for me and for the setup here, it's completely fine. So hopefully that's been some use, and I will see you again. Cheers.